The superpower that every citizen has is the ability to control where they spend their time, money, and attention. By focusing these on supporting local businesses, you are having a profound impact on your friends, your family, and your local community. So if you want to change the world, you can start with buying local.
Sky Zone Trampoline Park in Queensbury, New York. Elevate the way you celebrate at the best kids' birthday party place near you. We take care of all the hassle with planning birthday parties so you and your kids can focus on having fun. Check out our birthday party packages including private party areas, party invitations, supplies, a party host, and more. Come to Sky Zone Queensbury.
Welcome back, everyone, to Buying Local. I'm your host, Mike Nelson, joined today by Ray Apy from Biochar, Saratoga Biochar, Northeastern
Biochar is the parent company. Saratoga Biochar is the proposed local project.
Very nice. And which I know we're going to do a quick recap on the local project that, I think most people in the area are probably familiar with it at this point, but
they've heard.
Yeah, they've heard, and I know there's been some recent articles and I mean quite a bit of press, really, A
lot of press.
Any press is good press, as they say.
Free marketing.
So, but before we do, I feel like we've talked a lot about the project. People have heard a lot about the project, but there's obviously a lot more to Ray Apy than just this most recent project. So I figured, maybe kind of give us a little backstory about who you are and kind of where you were before you got into the whole biochar scene.
Sure, Mike. I'd be happy to give a little nickel tour of Ray's background.
Yeah.
Yep. I studied environmental science, engineering, and policy in undergraduate school and graduate school. Received a Master of Science degree from State University of New York, Environmental Science and Forestry, and that degree was combined with Syracuse University. Completed that in 1996, and I worked in the field for several years. In an aquatic toxicology research laboratory and in an environmental science and engineering consulting firm. And then I thought about going to law school. I thought about studying environmental law, took the LSAT and was thinking about SU law. And then I got scooped up as an engineer in the technology field, and that went well for me. I spent over 20 years working in tech, ended up running a family business, Anise & Associates. I sold that company in 2017 on behalf of its owners and worked for the buyer, a national company called Converge One, for a couple of years. And I left that in 2019 after I completed my contractual commitments there. And I began to work on this project. Kind of went back to my roots. I was looking for something to do, too early to retire. And I considered several things, but I really wanted to do something in the environmental science and engineering field. I really wanted to find something that would make a positive difference for the world in the waste management space. And I kind of stumbled into the idea of producing biochar from organic waste. It wasn't necessarily on track looking for that, but that's what found me. And as soon as I saw that, I was all over it. I started reading and learning and absorbing like a sponge. It was just really interesting to me. And a lot of what I studied in graduate school was waste management, solid waste management, hazardous waste management, landfill design, wastewater treatment, all those kind of things extensively, and actually worked with some of those things in my consulting experience after graduate school. So that was very interesting to me, and I went right back into it, dove in head first. And later in 2019, I created two companies, Northeastern Biochar, LLC, and then its first subsidiary, Saratoga Biochar Solutions, LLC, to be the first project company, and embarked on the path of finding a place to build a facility that would convert such organic waste into biochar. I settled on the idea of biosolids mainly as the feedstock or the organic waste that we would recycle and convert into something more beneficial. Mm-hmm. And the reason I did that is because it didn't take long to discover that the financial driver for it is strong, especially in more populated areas like the Northeast and particularly New York. The disposal fees for biosolids are very high in New York State. And we have three main avenues for disposal here in New York and pretty much everywhere. It's either landfilled or it's incinerated, where the solids are burned outright. And, all the emissions are very high with incineration. Emissions are very high with landfilling too. People don't realize that. You think, if you bury it in the ground, it's forgotten about. There's no emissions. Well, there is because it rots and emits a tremendous amount of methane and nitrous oxide, various other things. So those are very potent greenhouse gases. For example, methane is arguably 23 to 25 times more potent as a greenhouse gas than CO2, carbon dioxide. And so, that was interesting to me. And so I began looking at potential manufacturer partners and a place to do such a project. I met with the Saratoga County Economic Development Corporation. They introduced me to the town of Moreau. They said, hey, there's this really underutilized industrial park up in Moreau, and it has a lot of land and it has utilities that you need. And your first step would be to go and meet with the town supervisor and see what he thinks of it and see where that goes. So we did that. We met with prior supervisor Todd Kusniers, and he was very gracious. It seemed like we were being welcomed there with open arms, at least to review the potential. And he said, okay, your next stop is to visit the zoning administrator and discuss your project and have him bump that up against the town zoning codes and see if it's an applicable land use or not. And so I went through that step and found that it was an applicable or an allowable land use. It didn't require any variations or variance in zoning code for the industrial park. And so the zoning administrator then said, your next stop is the planning board. You have to complete a site plan application and go through the planning board's review process. So we filed that application in, I think it was around August of 2021 and went through about a 13-month review process with the Moreau Town Planning Board. We received approval for the project in August of 2022. And I guess that kind of gets us up to your question was, what was your background? How'd you get into this? So that brings us up to that point. So before I continue, I'll pause and bounce it back to you.
That's around the time when everything got really exciting, I'm sure. To kind of back up a little bit, though, I'm just curious as to, like you said, you kind of landed, like how do you land on biochar? And I, if anyone's listened to shows, like I'm a super geek about this stuff and about fertilizers and using fertilizers or not using fertilizers from a farming standpoint and the detriment and positives and all that fun stuff. So I'm fascinated by the biochar use as far as a fertilizer and the different forms, that as I've gotten into it and learned more about biochar, and there's just a lot of different use applications, but there's a lot of different let's say forms of biochar, right? But so I'm just curious how you kind of stumbled on it and how you decided, like, hey, this is where I'm going.
So I was reviewing opportunities to start a new business in or not in the environmental space, and I was reviewing potential profit and loss models with my accountant, and some of the things that I was looking at was just real estate, looking at things like that. And he said, Ray, given your background in environmental science and engineering, have you ever heard of biochar? And I was like, well, yes and no. I know what that is, but I'm not too familiar. Mm-hmm. And he said, well, I think it would be good for you to meet with my uncle. He is working with a manufacturer that has a patent on equipment that converts organic waste, particularly like biosolids or waste plant matter or wood feedstock, and can actually, in an industrial continuous process fashion, convert that into a granular biochar that's easily usable. And so to your point, there are a lot of different types of biochar, and there's a lot of different ways to make it. Yeah. And there are many different forms of feedstocks you can use to make it. And so all of those produce different outcomes. And anyway, the long story short, I met with his uncle, and I was fascinated by the concept. I did end up interviewing and meeting that manufacturer that he was partnered with. In the end, it wasn't the right fit for me or for our company. But yeah, that's really how I got so interested to start doing my own research and understand it better. And then I found out there's a whole world out there around biochar that most people don't know. But there's a United States Biochar Initiative organization. There's an International Biochar Initiative organization. I started reading all their materials. That led to research papers on different forms of making biochar. That's what led me down the road of understanding pyrolysis understanding the heating of material in an oxygen-starved environment at high temperatures where it basically carbonizes that organic material. And I learned about its effectiveness in separating out contaminants from material to push those out into a gas stream where the gas can be combusted and treated in an air emissions system. And so, it just kind of went from there. I just kept digging and researching and interviewing manufacturers. Along that path, I met my current business partners. They had formed a company called Element Carbon and had attempted to find a site to do basically the same thing down in the Hudson Valley, New York area. They had a site plan application in progress in the town of New Windsor. And in the middle of that process, there was an election and a change in elected officials, interestingly. And the new elected official did put a moratorium on all commercial industrial development in New Windsor at that time. And so at about that same time, I acquired their business. They were, quote unquote, starting to run out of gas, if you will.
Yeah.
And so I acquired their business and brought those guys on my team. They brought a lot of knowledge. One of the partners had created a business of biosolids land application and had been transporting and land applying biosolids for over 20 years. And he was looking for a better way to use these materials. During that course of his running that business, he became aware of the contaminants in biosolids and started to become very concerned about land application for his own self. And so he sold that business and developed a partnership with our other partner who was looking at all this and thinking the same thing. And so anyway, I met those guys, acquired their company, brought them on the team, and we worked together in one other location in Hudson Valley in Wallkill, New York. We didn't get as far as the site plan application. We had several meetings, first with the town supervisor, with the zoning person, and with the town engineer. And there was a lot of interest, and they wanted us to continue. I think on about our third or fourth meeting with those folks, they brought the town council in, and the town attorney advised that the town of Wallkill had adopted a town code about 20 years ago that prohibited the importation of any waste. Because at the time, 20 years prior, a waste management company was trying to site a landfill project there, and they didn't want the landfill. So so they were able to stop that before it happened and create that town law. So we just basically folded our notebooks and said, thanks for your time. And that was the end of Wallkill. But at that time, I was already in progress with Moreau. So, we focused our attention up here in Saratoga County at that point.
It's biochar, at least again, I'm not I don't have an environmental science degree, Ray. So bear with me. But the technology just to me seems amazing. Especially when you look at the problems that we have in this country, where on one side we have a big waste problem, not just human solids, but just garbage in general, right?
Everything.
Huge problem in the United States that most people are not aware of. And then on the other side of it, the other problem that we have is the topsoil and fertilizer or chemical input problem that we have in the United States, where we're running out of topsoil. We're using a lot of inputs, and a lot of those are chemical inputs that are ending up on our food, as opposed to something that is like biochar. That's, it's really not a chemical input, right? It's just organic matter and returning it back to organic matter. But
your point is good there. So the consistent use of synthetic fertilizer products over the last roughly 80 years since World War II. And I say World War II because the war machine of World War II chemical industrial complex created to produce chemical weapons was converted to something more productive, which was
fertilizer
to feed people. So that, and it is crazy, but that was a good thing because we've been able to feed our populations. If we hadn't done that, we would have had some real problems in crop production. However, after 7-8 decades of use of those types of fertilizers, we're degrading soils. So we put nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, NPK fertilizers on agricultural soils, and we get some return for that. Things grow, but those fertilizers are all produced and bonded by salts, which are corrosive in soil, which is something you and I have talked about before. So the ability to, displace that practice with something that returns organic matter and carbon to the soil without the salts and provides macro and micronutrient boost is enticing, because we not only have the opportunity to grow crops that we need, or whatever plant matter that we need, it also gives us the ability to restore soil health. Because biochar is very porous, it has a very high cation exchange capacity, and it has a very high porosity or surface area. Mm-hmm. So it has an amazing ability to retain water in soil. And interestingly, if you look at studies, and there have been countless studies of plant root and tissue growth in biochar versus non-biochar inoculated soils, you'll see that in the biochar inoculated soils, the plant roots grow to the char. In other words, they literally physically, the plant roots grow to it and they tap it. They grow around it and in it. And they do that because that's where the water is, and that's where the nutrients are. And in side-by-side studies, you can see plant root growth in soils that were not inoculated with biochar, that were instead fed with traditional water-soluble fertilizers. Mm-hmm. The plant roots tend to follow the water, and they follow the fertilizers, nutrients that are in the water. And if you look at the two side-by-side, in side-by-side field tests, you see the amount of root growth, the root mass is an order of magnitude higher with biochar inoculated soils versus traditional fertilizer inoculated soils. And so what you have there is you've got basically with biochar, you have with biochar that's made from something like biosolids that's high in nutrients, you have like an on-demand fertilizer. And the plant roots literally tap it and they pull what they need from it as they need it.
Yeah, a point that every regenerative farmer in the United States could talk about, especially if they're using livestock to graze, and they're, again, it's why you have sheep, it's why you have cattle grazing farmland, right? It's to help. It's basically, it's not biochar, it's just poop, right? Yeah. But it's animal poop, but it's for the same reasons.
Yeah, but you're returning organic matter to that soil, and you're not putting a lot of salt in the ground, which is corrosive. So
it's fascinating, and that whole chemical input problem is not a problem that is local to just the United States. I mean, it's a worldwide problem. When you look at all the protests that have been happening around the world, a lot of that is because of governments trying to stop farmers from using chemical inputs. Mm-hmm. But we'll talk about emerging markets a little bit later on here.
Sure.
But before we get to talking about that, maybe just give us a project update. I know that, I've read some things recently about where you guys are, and not to really get too buried by the situation in Moreau, but give us an update on that. What's going on there?
Well, I guess I'll describe the business from, locally, statewide, and then in a much broader context.
Yeah.
So locally, as you're aware, there was a change of the guard, if you will, with Moreau's government, and with the November election, and January 1st saw a new supervisor and a new board member enter the scene. So they now control the Moreau Town Board and are seeking a moratorium on development in the industrial land, and they're directly targeting. It's evident in the board meeting minutes, in the recordings of those meetings, and actually in the language of the draft moratorium itself. They're directly targeting Saratoga Biochar. They ran on a platform to stop Saratoga Biochar. The campaign was called Moreau United. And their website is still up, and you can go and look at it. Like their number one thing is to stop my business. That's what they campaigned on. So they're trying to honor their campaign promise, and I understand that. But,
let me interrupt though, because this is just something I just don't understand, and it's really kind of like stuck in my craw as I watch this go on through the news. And obviously my company does some work with you guys. We have, right, and so we're pretty familiar with the technology and the science and what you guys are trying to do. I mean, I don't work on your account day to day. We have people to do that. But as I've been watching this kind of whole process go on, and you've gotten through different permitting processes, right? Where the planning board, you've been following, you've done everything that they've asked you to do.
Oh, by the book,
right?
100%. That's what we have to stand on. We follow the letter of the law from day one.
Well, and not only that, but you also there's organizations, governmental bodies that are asking you to jump through hoops too. And I can't remember if it's DEC or EPA or both or all of them, or, you know what I mean? But I just don't understand how you can consistently move forward supply what you're being asked to supply to show that, you're not poisoning everyone, which is what everybody thinks, right? And so I guess, and then now, if the article that I read in the Post-Star is correct, then what it seemed to me was that they were not able to stop you throughout all these different processes. So instead, what they're going to do is they're going to try to change some laws to prevent your business from coming in. Like, is that a fair assessment? Am I out of bounds on that?
No, I think that's a very fair assessment. I mean, they campaigned on that promise. They had a activist environmental attorney come in and present at one of their opposition group meetings, and he said, well, you should try a moratorium, and you have a local law, Chapter 92, that prohibits the import of waste, but if you read that local law, it was crafted during the Hudson River PCB cleanup period, and it specifically calls out prohibiting the importation of hazardous waste.
Which, if I understand what you guys are bringing in, it's not hazardous waste because it would have to be tagged and transported in a specific way.
It would have to go to hazardous waste landfills. No, biosolids is not hazardous waste, and a lot of people think, well, it's because it's got trace, and when we use the word trace, we mean very small in terms of volume, quantities of contaminants in it. A lot of people think, well, if it's got a tiny little bit of mercury in it, then the whole thing is hazardous. Well, no, it's not. That's not how the laws are written. That's not how the regulations operate.
Mm-hmm.
It's not hazardous waste. It's organic waste. It's municipal organic waste. So it's not commercial waste. It's not industrial waste. It's not hazardous waste. But Moreau Law Chapter 92 was written to prohibit the import of Hudson River dredge soils that were contaminated with PCBs. It's very specific in its language.
Yeah.
And so anyway, they made the suggestion that, you could use that. Well, no, you can't. But back to your point, we had an extensive site plan review process. The planning board spent a lot of time deliberated. They had a planning board member who, once she woke up and realized what our application was, about 6 months after we got started, she started to oppose it, which is fine. And she pushed the rest of the planning board with a lot of hard questions and really forced the planning board to dig deeper and understand our project. And they did that, and then in the end, they voted to approve it with the conditions, and 16 conditions actually, many of which are operational conditions relative to continuous air monitoring, noise monitoring and compliance, odor monitoring and compliance. These were all things that were put in place to protect their constituents, the residents of Moreau that are reasonably close by to the
which is their job.
Which
right?
is their
That's
job.
Their job.
Absolutely.
Good for them for doing it, but at
Absolutely.
the same time, it just seems like, and every single thing, if I understand correctly, which maybe I'm wrong, but everything that you were asked for, you've supplied. And
Yes,
you've met
yes.
their conditions.
Yeah, so the main pre-construction condition was to proceed with the state with our DEC environmental permits. The facility would require a solid waste management facility permit and what's called an air state facility permit, which in layman's terms is an air emissions permit.
Mm-hmm.
And we have proceeded with that. We're almost at the end of the road with that. The New York State DEC spent over 2 years deliberating, evaluating, digging deeper and deeper. They were pushed by the public to do that, which I think is great. That's how the process should work.
Sure.
And they asked a lot of tough questions, and I think they issued us, it was either 6 or maybe 7 notices of incomplete application over, the first 2 years of the process. And an incomplete application notice just means we need more information.
Mm-hmm.
We're not done here,
Right.
which is fine. So we did that. We answered, and you called it, jumping through hoops. It took a long time, and it was a lot of work, but we were happy to do it.
Sure. Well, and again,
because
maybe not a bad thing for a new technology. People are worried. People are nervous about,
yeah.
And especially, I can't speak for other areas, but I know in this area, obviously, we've had some unfortunate things happen in the past with other companies before any of those rules existed.
Before the DEC even existed.
Right. That's what,
yeah.
And that was another thing I really didn't understand through this process, but whatever. And then the other thing though, that I've just been, shocked about, I guess, is as you go through this process and I'm reading all these articles, and I have continually seen the use of terms like sewage sludge, like incorrectly.
Yes.
And almost to a point, and this is something like, at some point, I don't know how other people don't see it, but it just looks like bullying and gaslighting to me. And so kind of like, really just to be fair, kind of makes me a little frustrated, upset. Maybe I'm sure you feel a lot more than frustrated, upset sometimes. But like I just don't understand how those terms, how incorrectly. Well, I guess my point with me saying all this, Ray, is I feel like maybe you've been very generous by not suing everyone involved at this point, because it just seems like there's defamation. And again, I'm not a lawyer. I'm just a podcast host right now. But I like, are the terms they're using, like what do you have to say about that?
Well, I could go on and on about that. I'll give you a quick recent little nugget to think about. The Times-Union recently published an article, and the original headline of the article, which came out in print, was relative to referring to Saratoga Biochar as a sewage sludge plant.
Oh, nice.
And with that one, we actually did write a letter to the managing editor and asked for a correction. And we basically said, you're referring to us as who produces sewage sludge? Wastewater treatment plants do. Where does it come from? You, me, and everybody else.
Yeah.
So don't. That's not what we are, and that is gaslighting. We are a recycling facility that takes biosolids, which is not sewage sludge, although those terms are used interchangeably. We've talked about that before.
Yeah.
But the technical definition, there is a disparity between those terms, sewage sludge and biosolids. Sewage sludge is referred to generally as untreated and still liquid form, raw sewage. And biosolids is treated. And the treatment is the water's, the solids are allowed to settle. The water is skimmed off. The water's treated and released into a water body or a moving water body, and that's how we recover water to the environment. The solids are typically then digested aerobically or anaerobically, and the most common method is to introduce bacteria into the settled pond of the sewage sludge. The bacteria consume all the organic matter. The bacteria population explodes. When it runs out of food, it dies. And so that's treated, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what happens when that occurs is there's a massive reduction of pathogens. It doesn't make the end product of that process admirable or necessarily safe to handle. It certainly still smells horrible, but it's not the same material.
Yeah.
It's been treated, and it hasn't been treated to the point where I think you'd want to use it in your garden,
right?
At least in my opinion. But it's been treated, and at that point it is now biosolids, and biosolids are defined by the U.S. EPA and by every state in the union, and they're regulated in terms of how they are transported and how they're disposed of. And the disposition is, as I said before, it's landfilling, it's incineration, or it's composting and direct land applications. Mm-hmm. So when you take biosolids and then compost it, you can add lime to try to reduce the odor, and the composting process further reduces the pathogen count, disease vectors, down to the point where it is far safer to handle. Mm-hmm. And that creates what's called Class A biosolids, which are used in, I think, still 46 states for land application as an organic matter nutrient supply for agricultural soils. And in a lot of cases, too, that material is actually dried and sold on retail store shelves. You can go to Home Depot here in Saratoga County today, and you can buy what's called Milorganite. That's dried biosolids that comes from Milwaukee. And it's actually a fairly popular. I don't think it's recommended for use on food crops, but it's very popular for use on lawns and things like that because it's pretty effective. But it's not. It doesn't treat that material the way that we do. It doesn't eliminate the contaminants. The volatile organic compounds, PFAS, things like that.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question. I was like, well, so the Milorganite could be sitting there on the shelf. You're going to go throw it on your lawn, and it's got PFAS in it.
Yeah.
Right.
And I guarantee you, somebody in Moreau buys that and uses it. I guarantee you. Probably more than one person.
Well, and that was the other thing, too. I kept reading about the fear of PFAS getting released into the environment, and rightly so. And, at the same time, I'm like, I wonder how many of those people stopped using nonstick pans or any of the places where PFAS actually comes from. Like, who's cooking their eggs?
Let's talk about that for a second. So the PFAS compounds are perfluoroalkyl compounds. There are thousands of them now. The originals were like PFOA and PFOS, and they were invented by accident, I think. But it was recognized they make a great surfactant and a nonstick, and the fluorine bond is very, very strong. So you can when used on things like nonstick pans. The first time you heat the pan, it doesn't go away. It stays there.
Right.
If you heat the pan too many times, it starts to come off and ends up in your food.
Yeah.
Which means it ends up in your body, which means it ends up at the wastewater treatment plant or your septic system and directly into the groundwater.
Yeah.
And the thing about those compounds is because of that fluorine bond, they're very difficult. They don't just they don't break down in nature readily on their own, but with enough heat they sure do. If you get it hot enough, you break the bond. Yeah. It's just that simple. And if you keep it hot enough and turbulent, like in a thermal oxidizer, the way that we do in our process, you can ensure that bond that doesn't recombine and make some other form of PFAS. PFAS is a general roll up of all thousands of those types of compounds.
Well, and I got to tell you too, Kristen, my fiance, probably has a bone to pick with you because of you and your project and everything I learned.
You had to get rid of your nonstick.
We're now on cast iron, strictly on cast iron, and we got rid of all that stuff.
I mean, we do the same. Stainless steel is great, and stainless steel, cast iron. But, it doesn't stop there. So first of all, I think it's really important to point out that the state of New York is regulating PFAS compounds for any sort of recycling and biosolids to 20 parts per billion. So we can't receive, and waste haulers can't deliver to Saratoga Biochar any biosolids that exceed that threshold. So right out of the gate, we're at such a low level on the way in, and we remediate it. So there's not going to be anything found coming out the stack. It's just it's literally not possible, despite what people say. But let's talk a little bit more about those.
You're spending a lot of money on that promise.
Oh my God, yeah, and because of the extensive permitting process and the public concern, we've increased the capacity of our thermal oxidation. We went from a single stage thermal oxidizer operating at 1,800 degrees to a multi-stage thermal oxidizer that starts at 2,300 degrees and has 2 further stages. And we've continued to enhance the air treatment system that catches everything after the thermal oxidizer before it's emitted to the environment and to the air. But PFAS is found in a lot more than nonstick pans. It's in like almost everything. Your newspaper, it's in your paper. Why is it in your paper? Because it's used in abundance on paper rolls because it's nonstick. And it allows that paper to get rolled and produced very easily without having to get bound up and sticking.
I just saw a thing the other day about toilet paper having PFAS.
It's in all paper.
Yeah.
It's in all paper that's rolled, that's in commercially produced and rolled. It's in, if you have any Gore-Tex or any sort of water-resistant clothing, anything, it's in that. That's what makes it water-resistant. That's what makes Gore-Tex Gore-Tex.
I was researching, I don't know, there's this new health and fitness craze with hydrogenated water or hydrolyzed water. Hydrolyzed. Yeah. So, again, I'm just a dumb podcaster, guys. So, but I was reading about these different containers, and it turns out that, the containers themselves are loaded with PFAS.
Oh yeah, a lot of especially fast food or temporary food containers are coated with some form or another of PFAS because it creates a nonstick surface. Did you ever get a styrofoam plate at a summer picnic and you put something kind of sloppy on there, maybe some barbecue sauce or something, and you notice that, with a paper plate, it sort of absorbs into the paper and it leaves a stain. And with a coated styrofoam, it kind of runs off like oil on water. That's PFAS.
Sweet.
And it's in your eating utensils. The disposable eating utensils, plastic cups. Not in all of them, but it's still in a lot. They're I think so the net of this all is that if people don't want to deal with PFAS in the environment, then they need to push their legislators to stop, to have our manufacturers stop making it and stop using it in products. Let's talk about stain resistant things. How about carpeting that has any sort of DuPont stain resistant carpet loaded with PFAS? Your kids are playing on it, in your house if you have that, that sort of thing. So anyway, we could go on and on.
No, I know.
PFAS is used ubiquitously in so many products. And so just to be clear, Northeastern Biochar and its subsidiaries, we do not manufacture PFAS. We don't use it in anything that we do. Our process actually eliminates trace amounts of it from biosolids. Yeah. That's what we do. We stop it from proliferating in the environment.
So let's kind of, I want to talk about some of the emerging technology part of this, right? Because we're already kind of talking about the technology stuff.
Sure.
And again, people are familiar with what you guys are doing at this point.
Let's talk about tech, Mike. But also, I want to come back. We kind of got a bit myopic around the local opposition in Moreau and the permitting process and all that. I'm happy to go back into any of that. But there's been a lot happening outside of this region too with our business.
Well, yeah, that's what I wanted to
whatever
hear
you want
about
to
for
do,
sure.
but we should come back to that at some point.
Yeah. So, well, let's kind of go there. So, because of this emerging technology, right?
Mm-hmm.
It sounds, if I understand correctly, you've got some other interest in what you guys are doing.
We do,
and
we have
it's
substantial other interest.
So tell us a little bit about that.
So we've been, and this has a lot to do with the press. The press, whether it's been a lot of negative press and some positive press here locally in the Saratoga or the Greater Capital District, in the media outlets here. A lot of that has actually, believe it or not, been proliferated far and wide. We're getting international calls. We have an opportunity for a project in Australia right now, and we were found by a global scale engineering firm that's looking for a solution to a biosolids problem in part of Australia. Now, interestingly, Logan, Australia, was one of our references for, hey, this is a place where, here's a public-private partnership that's already built a biosolids processing facility. They use gasification. That's a different technology. It's intended to mainly recover energy from biosolids, but they still produce a fair amount of biochar.
Yeah.
They make that char available.
And they're recovering energy. They're actually creating electricity from biochar. Is that?
I'm not sure what they do with it. They're recovering gas. It would be something that you could burn, and you could use that to turn a turbine if you want to convert to electricity.
Yeah.
It's not very efficient, but I don't really know what they do with the energy, but they recover energy and they produce some biochar. Anyway, so it was interesting to me that now we have this opportunity in Australia where they were one of the first countries in the world to have quite a large facility already operating, slightly different technology, gasification versus pyrolysis. Pyrolyzing biosolids has been going on in Europe for quite a long time. And as a matter of fact, Europe actually exports biochar from biosolids to the United States.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Where does that end up?
In various products. If you can go buy biochar. You can buy biochar on Amazon.com. Just go to Amazon.com, put in biochar. You'll get a whole list of materials.
And is that's coming from outside the U.S.?
Yeah, some of it, yeah. I don't know. I mean, it's coming from in and out in Canada, the U.S., and from outside.
And now I'm just curious. Those processes for creating biochar, they don't eliminate the contaminants like your process does.
I think they do, actually.
Oh, they
do.
The
European Union's pretty advanced, actually, and they're definitely ahead of us in terms of biosolids management and conversion to biochar. And interestingly, some of the comments recently made to the DEC from an environmental group that's joined our opposition tried to reference one little myopic piece of a European Union standard for biochar and saying how they're not doing this in Europe, and they failed to review the entire article, because if you read the whole thing, it actually completely supports what we're doing. They just cherry picked a few keywords that made it look like no one in Europe is doing this.
Wow.
It's comical. But anyway, it has drawn attention. The negative and the positive press it's reaching quite a wide audience. A lot of industry trade groups, and by trade groups I mean in and around solid waste management, in and around wastewater management. In and around biochar itself, in and around forestry. I've been contacted by, people who own property and harvest trees for various purposes, and who have said things like, there's a guy down in Westchester that said, I have like 1 million trees here that are just sitting here rotting. They're of no commercial value. I can't, if you want them, if you can come take them, you can have them to make your biochar. And I said, well, I wish I could, but the cost to pick all that up and transport it somewhere where I could process it is just not going to work. But anyway,
because the wood's involved in the initial stage, right?
Yeah, we mix. Our final recipe is about 10% wood waste, clean wood waste. Nothing that's contaminated or has oil paint on or anything like that. Just clean wood, like storm cleanup or leftover from the forestry industry or the wood processing industry, lumber industry, so any kind of clean sawdust, broken up old pallets that aren't contaminated, but they, when pallets are at end of life, they get chipped up and typically get hauled to a landfill, or in some cases they get hauled and burned for energy, which puts all that ash and stuff up in the air. So, we're open to those. But anyway, the final recipe is about 10% wood waste and 90% biosolids. That's So my point being, from far and wide, we're getting inquiries on all different kinds of things. We've been contacted by multiple higher education research institutions here in the United States and outside of the U.S., asking us about our process, asking us if we could share the lab data from our testing, talking about what they're doing. They have graduate students that are analyzing, biosolids conversion to biochar and a bunch of different capacities. And
how does that work when they're asking for you to share that data? Because obviously this is it's a newer process. You guys are doing some things differently. There's an intellectual property that goes along with that. I mean, how does that work? Like, do you share that data with them, or how does?
Well, it's at the point now where we've given the New York State DEC everything that we have, and so there's only a few, very technical details about our process left that we consider really valuable trade secret that we wouldn't share, and that's not the kind of thing that a research institution really needs.
Would care
sharing
about,
lab data, sharing the composition of the biochar that we've made, sharing the details of our prior testing, sharing the higher level, process flow, how our system works. We've been very open. And at the end of the day, why wouldn't we? I mean, I'd like to see this technology proliferated. I'm not just doing this for myself. I'm doing it because I think it's the right way to go in waste management. I believe firmly that you are going to see over the next 10 to 20 years pyrolysis technology proliferate, not just for conversion of biosolids, but also municipal solid waste. And
I just had a conversation about that the other day with someone randomly that brought that up, actually.
So we've been contacted by so many different organizations. We have such a diversity of locations where we could do projects, where we could partner. We have public-private partnership opportunities developing in California and Colorado, in a couple other states, even here in New York State. I won't say where. The New York State Department of Environmental Protection. The New York City DEP just released a request for interest. They're considering biosolids conversion to deal with the New York City's biosolids problem.
Well, we have to do something.
They have to do something. What they do now, that they do now and that they have been doing is load it up on trains and haul it down to Alabama to go to landfills.
Yeah, but we're running out of landfills.
We're running out of landfills, and it's just stupid and too expensive to do it that way.
Yeah.
When it can be converted easily and cleanly and made into something that can be beneficially reused. So even New York City's looking at it, and then not only looking at it, but they're looking at us. And ironically, they released that RFI just a couple weeks after the New York State DEC released our notice of complete application. We thought the timing was fortuitous. We had actually met with New York City DEP back in October anyway, so they were already well aware of what we were working on.
Yeah.
And we were shortlisted for that RFI. It mostly went to other engineering firms and stuff, and we were one of the only real solution providers that were included on the list.
And so forgive my ignorance on that. So when you say completion of application, what does that mean? Does that mean you're done, or?
That means that they don't have any more questions for us.
Okay.
So as I mentioned earlier, I think over the course of roughly 2 years, we had received about 6 notices of incomplete application.
Gotcha.
With each one of those, they would ask deeper questions, give us more data, address these concerns, tell us more about your process. And it got to the point where after a couple of years, they didn't have any more questions.
Gotcha.
So when that happens, they issue what's called a notice of complete application. And as soon as that occurs, if it's something of high profile like this, if they feel a need, they open up a public comment period, as they did. They hold public hearings, which they did. And interestingly, if you want to talk about public participation, the standard for public comment period is 30 days, and there's usually not a hearing. In our case, they started with a 45-day public comment period. They held a public hearing which went over 2 days. One was virtual, one was in person.
Yeah.
And then they extended the comment period another 2 weeks. So it was really a 60-day comment period for something that's normally 30.
So it's not like people have a chance to get heard.
Yeah. No one can claim that the state has not supported public participation and entertained the opinions of everybody. So,
well, and it sounds like, with all the interest from around the country, out of the country, it sounds like, answering all those questions.
It's exploding. So yeah, back to the interest from far and wide. We're working on a project right now. We may have to completely re-engineer our technology, but we have a possibility of using a variation of our technology, not in Moreau and not here in New York at all, somewhere out west coast area, to centrally process railroad ties, which are loaded with arsenic. Railroad ties are treated heavily with tar type materials to make them last as long as possible. And then when they reach end of life, they get pulled out of the railroad, they get replaced with a new one. But that material just piles up. You
can't just burn them, right?
No, you can't just, well, you can, but that would be horrible. It would be a bad idea. So, I mean, but honestly, they just pile up. There are railroads throughout the United States have massive piles of railroad ties all over the place. But the cool thing about it is they're all adjacent to a railroad line. So if you wanted to set up centralized processing, it wouldn't be that hard, and it would be very cost effective to start to transport old railroad ties to one place. And so think about that. Chip them up and run them through a pyrolysis kiln and create a useful biochar. It wouldn't be anything like what we're going to make in Moreau. It would be very high in carbon, very low in nutrients, but it's a great way to sequester carbon. It can be used for lots of different things, but our process would pull the contaminants out and make the end product useful for other things. Here's another example. We've been contacted by Owens Corning, who has an interest in possibly using our product for use in their asphalt shingle line, because they recognize the instability of the fossil fuel market and the rising costs, and the concerns about availability of fossil fuels for these kind of things in the future. And so they're looking for alternate aggregate products for roof shingles. And here's another one. We were recently contacted by an organization that makes custom carbon concrete products. Carbon concrete is lighter. It sequesters carbon back into a permanent fixed place in the ground or in a building. It wouldn't be very cost effective to use for road work or for sidewalks, concrete that's used like that. But this company makes custom products, like very unique types of blocks and things like that. And they received a Microsoft grant, and their emphasis is all about carbon sequestration and being a climate change mitigation tool.
Well, that's one thing that I keep thinking about is with, all the talk of climate change and the crisis that we're in, and, with all the available money being made, all the money being made available to the EV market and really anything that's green related, I would think that technologies like this are on high demand.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they are. And so, that part of it. So the local stuff's been frustrating. The delays have been frustrating. The delays include additional costs that are frustrating. But at the same time, Mike, over the last year or so, and particularly within the last 6 months, and especially within the last 45 days alone, it's like the lid has blown off on it. And I'm getting solicitations almost on a daily basis now for things that are real, for organizations that are interested in our technology, and for actual business opportunities that are real with municipalities, and in other cases with private sector industries.
That's amazing. Mm-hmm. Must be a good feeling.
It is a good feeling. We got to get one of these things built somewhere. And the whole point of the first phase of the first project in Moreau was it's a pilot phase. I mean, we applied for a site plan for a 3-phase facility, fairly large. It's not nearly as big as it could be, but it's fairly large. But even at 3 full phases fully operating, it would never be more than 50 delivery trucks per day. The emissions would never require a federal EPA Title V permit. It's just that low. It's actually an ultra low emissions facility. But the first phase is 1/3 of its capacity, and the whole point of that was as a demonstration. So we start small, very small, and we give a year to 2 years to run the facility, work the bugs out, and do a lot of stack testing. So a lot of people are complaining, the DEC is only going to require you to stack test once in 6 months and then every 5 years. Well, that's just what they do. That's the state standard. That doesn't mean that's what we're going to do. Right. It's in my best interest to get a lot of data on our emissions,
especially if you're growing into other markets.
Because I'm going to take that everywhere I go. Why wouldn't I want that? If I try to hide, it just would be stupid to hide it. We've committed to the town of Moreau that we'll be transparent. Any testing we do will be made available on our website, the analytical results. We have a program for continuous monitoring of the kind of emissions that can be continuously monitored, like NO2 and ammonia and things like that, odor, noise. Those things can be continuously monitored 24/7. But actually stack testing for things like PFAS compounds, you have to actually take a sample from the exhaust stream and send it to a lab. There is no technology that exists for continuously monitoring for things like that, or dioxins or metals. And those things have to be lab tested. It's the only way.
Mm-hmm.
And so, we just because the DEC's draft permit says it's only going to be every 5 years doesn't mean that's what we're going to do. I mean, the best thing I could possibly do is build a data set that's deep and wide and take that with me everywhere I go. Because we already know what the results are going to be. There's no doubt. We've tested it enough. We already know. And so we want to have that information available. It'll help us sell future projects all over the place. Yeah. And it'll help other companies and other governments and other countries do the same thing. Follow the model that works. That's what needs to happen.
Must be pretty exciting being on the front side of that.
It is. Like, there's a lot of frustrating elements, and, starting a new business, especially something at scale that's industrial, is fraught with, pitfalls and frustrations, and it's really hard. I've lost a lot of sleep. I bet my retirement on it. I think I'm driving my family crazy. But I know it's the right thing to do. I'm not going to give up, and we're going to get to the finish line and do something good.
That's awesome. Ray, if people want to learn more about Northeast and Saratoga Biochar and the kind of stuff that you guys are doing, how do they find you? Well, there's a lot of ways. I think the easiest way is you could go to, probably the easiest thing is to just email info, INFO, at northeasternbiochar, as one word, .com. Info at northeasternbiochar.com. We're not such a big company yet. We're actually still very small. We're a startup. I see all those. Anything that comes in, I will see it. Okay. That's awesome. Thanks, everybody, for listening. Ray, thanks for coming to talk with us. Give us an update on the project, and good luck with everything. And thanks, everybody, for listening. Thanks for having me. Good to be back, Mike. Take care.
The Eden Center is a private psychiatry practice that focuses on the root cause of mental health conditions. We believe in brain-based treatment that incorporates the tenets of good mental health: nutrition, sleep, mindfulness, exercise, and social interactions. Whether you need help with mental health, addiction and recovery, or general wellness, the Eden Care Center can help shape you into your best you.
The superpower that every citizen has is the ability to control where they spend their time, money, and attention. By focusing these on supporting local businesses, you are having a profound impact on your friends, your family, and your local community. So if you want to change the world, you can start with buying local.